Welcome to Startup Grind at the Penn Innovation Center. We're excited to have you guys here. We're super gracious. Where's Carter and his team? We're super gracious to have you guys at the Penn Innovation Center. We'll talk about Penn Innovation in a second. But before we get started, I want to go over a couple of our sponsors who make Startup Grind possible. We wouldn't be here without some of these sponsors. Pepper Hamilton, who is our legal partner at 1776, used to be Benjamin's desk. Capstone Insurance, they are our go-to on anything on the business insurance side. They actually represent us and several companies in our space. And we wouldn't be able to have this video if it wasn't for Hum Creative, who's behind the video camera, big friends of the company, fantastic ecosystem champions as well. Let me give you a little bit of the roadmap before I introduce Brett. So we're going to go through about a 45-minute Q&A. We're going to be chopping up a lot of this video. We're going to be recycling it a bit, using it for programming, using it for national. If you haven't been to a Startup Grind event before, there's about 450 Startup Grinds across the world. 450. We were chapter like number 65, believe it or not, about 4 or 5 years ago. So we're excited to see it grow. We're excited to have people like Brett on with us today. But the purpose of Startup Grind is to inspire, educate, and connect. So as this thing kicks off at the very end, think about some questions you may have for Brett. Think about some questions that may add value to the conversation. Again, this is much more than 40 people sitting in a room. We're hoping that we can share this video out, chop it up for future entrepreneurs that are coming through our program, and use it in a real unique way. Normally, if we weren't on amazing startup bleachers like Penn Innovation Center, I'd have everybody stand up and help me welcome one of my guests here today. But let me give you some background. So Brett Topche's here with us. We're excited. His wife's also here. We have to give a little shout out to him. What's up, Al? We're excited to have Brett, not only because of his background and what he's currently doing today, but what he means to Philadelphia. Brett's one of the most responsive and accessible VCs and leaders in our ecosystem. So I'm going to go take you through a journey today around Brett's background, hopefully ask some good, tough questions as well to get to the core of who Brett is and what Red and Blue does on a daily basis. But please, no need to stand up, but help me welcome co-founder, managing partner, Brett Topche from Red and Blue Ventures. Wow, that's a good ovation. You know, Brett, I'm a big fan of yours. You know that. I would, out of transparency, Brett is a friend of mine. But beyond getting to know you over the past couple of years, watching you as an ecosystem leader make time for folks, being available and accessible, that's how a young ecosystem like Philly becomes even more mature. This conversation won't be just about the sexy and the cool things that happen in your world. We want to get to the core of understanding the ebbs and flows that come with the entrepreneurs, the founders, but also with the VCs. So before we jump into pre-MentorTech days, MentorTech, Red and Blue, who are you? Give us some background. Who are your parents? Who shaped your attitude and your perspective?
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun. Thanks everyone for coming out. I know you're mostly here for the pizza and you're just suffering through me, but I do appreciate you coming anyway. My background, I grew up in central New Jersey. My mom is, she was home with my sisters and I. My dad's an accountant. Actually got a lot of my interest in business from my dad from watching some of the stuff that he did. I remember in one case being on a long car ride with him back from central Pennsylvania. And to give you a sense of how long ago this was, he was on the car phone, so not a regular cell phone. The Bluetooth wasn't a thing. This was the big old clunky brick. Exactly. It was physically attached to the car. And he was helping negotiate a deal, and every now and again they'd hop off the phone. He'd kind of go back and explain to me what just happened and what everybody was trying to accomplish and what he was trying to help his clients do. And I was really fascinated by how all these deals were getting done. And so that was kind of the start of it for me. Remember reading some business books when I was a kid. I got my hands on a copy of Liar's Poker, a fantastic book by Michael Lewis, if anyone hasn't read it. I think I was probably about 13 or 14 when I read it. So in those days, I thought business was really interesting because they got to curse a lot. So this is sort of the level that I was operating on. But was sort of fascinated by investing from that, and then got really lucky. The district where I went to high school, they had this group of programs called specialized learning centers. So either you could go to the high school that you would go to geographically, or you could apply for the specialized learning center at any of the schools, and they all had different specialties. The high school I was going to go to anyway, their specialty was business. I'm like, well, I've been interested in this my whole life. Whether or not I choose to go into business, I think it would be a really interesting background to have. So I did that in high school and continued on doing business in college. And Yeah, here we are.
Stay there for a second, before we jump into some of the hardcore things you've done on the VC side and on the advising side and even on the board side. Talk a little bit about, and I know you have 2 boys, I have 3 boys, talk a little bit about what you can do now as a father with kids to expose them to a mindset that's different, a mindset that can hopefully be more 21st century than a past mindset.
Absolutely. So great timing on this, and I didn't intentionally tee you up with this a couple minutes ago, but my 8-year-old is currently at a coding class right now. If you're here in Philly, it's a terrific program called Coded by Kids, run by Sylvester Mobley and Danae Mobley. That starts kids as young as 8 years old, learning to code, starting with HTML, getting into JavaScript, and just exposing them right from a really young age that, hey, technology is the language of the future, and to me it's every bit as important to learn as a kid as English and math and all the other stuff that you do in school. So thankfully we've been able to do that. I try to make it a point to bring my kids where I can to some of the startup events in Philadelphia. Obviously there are some that are a bit more kid-friendly than others, but things like the Entrepreneur Expo that Philly Startup Leaders puts on every year during Tech Week. I brought my son to that this year and just show him all of the entrepreneurial activity that's happening around him and try to instill that mindset. And I'll hopefully do the same with my younger one soon, but he's 4, so I don't know if he's quite ready for that.
And I'll move on from the personal side, but before I do, obviously we have a really engaged Slack community at 1776, and one of the questions I posed earlier this week was, get me a question for Brett. What are you thinking? Everybody knows who Brett is. What would be a question you would ask him up here? And it's one of the best storytellers we have in our ecosystem. His name is Roberto Torres. He's the lead reporter for Technically Philly. And he goes, I'm always fascinated by Brett's family dynamic, meaning he always has a good balance. And I don't know if Elle's rolling her eyes up there or not, but I doubt it. Talk a little bit about what that balance means, because I think it does relate to the entrepreneur. And what are some of the best practices you use to make sure you don't become heads down all the time and you can maybe be there in the moment at the right time?
It's a few things. One of them, we've made a very conscious choice to live in the city where I work as opposed to having a commute in my life, and it takes me between 5 and 10 minutes to get here from home, and that's an extra 45 minutes or an hour every day that I can make sure that I'm home. And there are things that maybe would be a little bit easier in the suburbs, but I think that extra 45 minutes or an hour a day with my kids is not something that I'm willing to trade. I think it's really important, and this is whether you're a VC or an entrepreneur or whatever you're doing, to have a really open and honest relationship with your partner. I encourage Elle to call me out on it if I'm too busy in work mode and not paying enough attention to what's going on at home. And you have to not just say it, but you have to mean it. You have to say, look, this, as a father, you have to have that commitment that I am going to be there with my family. And there's always another meeting, but my kids are only going to be 8 and 4 once. So I think that's really important as a mindset. And some of it is there are certain things you have to sacrifice. So I can't make it to every event that I otherwise might make it to. There are nights that I'm doing email at 11 o'clock at night because I left the office at 5 o'clock to go to a soccer practice. And that's a trade-off that I'm willing to make.
Awesome. We're going to go deeper, but I want to jump right into this. Share a little bit, and how I'd like to introduce next topics, specifically on MentorTech. Tell me a story about Jet.com, and then we'll unpack that even further as far as how your roles and responsibilities changed over, I think, 11 some years.
Yeah. So it's an interesting one that you picked. Obviously, it was a great success for us, but Jet.com was in many ways an exception. We had invested in Mark Lurie, who was the CEO in Jet. We had invested in his previous company, Quidsy, in the early days of MentorTech, and thankfully did really well with that investment. Got to see Mark in action. I think he is as good an e-commerce entrepreneur as exists on planet Earth. And if you see what's going on with Walmart's e-commerce since he took over there, I think that's really playing itself out. So the lesson from Jet was it's all about the people. When Mark came to us with the idea for Jet, he basically said, okay, so I'm going to have this website, and you're going to have to pay a membership fee to be able to shop on our e-commerce site, which is just an incredible amount of friction. We're also going to compete on price with Amazon, and we're going to make it up with these membership fees.
What was the year? How long ago was this?
This was about 2011, 2012. Probably closer to 12. But when he came to us with that idea, actually it couldn't have been 12. It must have been 13 already. The years are all running together at this point. But he came to us with that idea. You're going to compete head up with Amazon on price. What are you, nuts? Oh, by the way, in order to execute on this business plan, over time, we're going to have to raise $4 billion. Yeah. Now, 99.999% of humanity, the meeting would have ended there. But because it was Mark, we wrote a check. And the lesson is you can get away with outlandish ideas if people have that level of confidence in you. Sure. And we had seen Mark in action, and we knew if anyone could pull it off, he could. And it was possible even he couldn't pull it off, but thankfully he did.
So give a little background to everybody. MentorTech, how did it come about? At what level did you actually jump into the company or the firm?
Sure.
And talk about your progression as a leader.
Sure. So MentorTech was started in 2005 by Michael Aronson and Boris Kalendar. Michael had been a serial software entrepreneur, had started several companies all around Penn. So he started out as a student at Penn, starting a software company with one of his professors, ultimately sold that company and then started another company called Strategic Management Group that was doing sort of a subset of what that first company was doing, was on the senior leadership team of that company for almost 20 years. During that time, he was also teaching at Penn and taught there for 12 years teaching entrepreneurship and made angel investments in several companies started by his students. So when they sold SMG and he was trying to figure out, as he likes to say, what he was going to do when he grew up, people said, you've had pretty good success making investments in these concepts that are on campus and trying to bring them out into the world. Why don't you build a fund around that? And so that was the genesis of MentorTech. And he worked with Boris on that, who had been one of his coworkers at SMG. That was 2005. I got to know him around that time. I was at another venture fund at the time called NJTC Venture Fund over in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And we got to know each other at networking events, and we looked at a few deals together, and we built a little bit of a relationship. And by 2007, I had already left NJTC. I'd gone off to another firm called Hamilton Lane out in Bala Cynwyd that's more on the fund investing side of the world. But Michael reached back out to me and he said, we're getting ready to raise another fund, and we're looking to staff up. We've got 15 companies from our first fund, and we're about to raise another fund, and we're going to have a whole bunch more portfolio companies. We've got some other stuff that we're working on. It's more than 2 people can do. We're looking to build out the team. And because I had that pre-existing relationship, I was able to get into that process. It wasn't really publicly advertised.
Yeah, pause there for a second, though. Take yourself back to that moment. What were some of the hard skills that you felt confident and maybe others looked at you like, man, he was solid at getting that job done? Was it identifying companies? Was it doing the background, the fast track type due diligence? I
mean, I think a lot of it was the due diligence. That was where a lot of my career had been in the early days when I was at NJTC Venture. To their credit, they kind of threw me in the deep end of the pool and said, go figure it out. And a lot of what I was doing due diligence on these companies. It was, okay, we're going to introduce you to an entrepreneur that's doing something that you've never heard of in an industry that you don't know anything about. Start forming an opinion, and you better do a lot of research and talk to people who actually know what they're talking about, because you obviously don't.
Gosh, you probably have some stories, man.
Oh, yeah.
We'll save them for now, but because I want to keep going down this.
Yeah, you have to get comfortable being the least informed person in the room, I think is the key.
You got to be a good information gatherer. I want to jump into a little bit of MentorTech, your role and responsibility later on the stage, but there's one story that popped out at me. And it's one of the greatest Philadelphia stories, I think, with Curelate. Well, give some background on what what Storably was.
Right. So when we first invested in Curelate, it wasn't Curelate. It was Storably. It was Apu Gupta and Josh Coet came to us with this idea of Airbnb for storage and parking. So this was the very early days of the sharing economy, and people were looking at Zipcar and Airbnb and all these other ways of leveraging assets. And they said, well, I don't know, we kind of like the idea of Airbnb, but it's a little creepy having random strangers in your house. But maybe it would be okay to just have their stuff in your house. And we're all living in Philadelphia at the time and saying, well, nobody seems to have enough space. And yet there's these people who have maybe unfinished basements or whatever, and you can store their stuff, or you got some space behind your house and someone can park their car there. And it was this whole concept about the sharing economy. And worked with them to bring in Nick Shifton as the third co-founder to build out the tech side of things. And we were really excited. It was the sharing economy. It was going to happen. They did an incredible job of getting PR. One of the biggest challenges for any consumer startup is awareness. So no one's going to buy your product if they don't know it exists. I don't think I'm saying anything terribly earth-shattering there. To their great credit, they solved for awareness. They got the best PR I've ever seen. They were on every local TV station, radio station, telephone pole, hangers on your doorknob. Everybody knew about Storably. And so we're like, all right, the word is out. Everyone's excited about this concept. Here it comes. And you look at the server logs, and it was just crickets. Nobody was showing up. And it was one of these great oh shit moments. And what they realized was they had a lot of demand for parking, but not nearly enough supply, and plenty of supply for storage, and not nearly enough demand. And by solving for awareness, they were able to figure that out. And they had big enough numbers on both sides that they could say, okay, there really is a supply and demand mismatch here. And they came back to us, and I remember sitting down with, with Apu, and he said, well, here's the thing. We tried, we tried Storably, and this is probably 120 days after we had invested. So not a conversation you want to be having 4 months into an investment. But he said, we built Storably, and it's a dud.
And are they saying this in the boardroom, or are they calling you up on the phone individually to tee you up?
We initially had the conversation separately,
okay.
And then we had the conversation officially in the boardroom.
We're going to talk best practices around what that looks like when stuff does go to crack. What should you do in that moment? What happens next? But keep going.
So he said, there's sort of 3 paths that we're looking at. He said, we can keep at it, but I don't think, or 4 paths really. We can keep at it, but the data is kind of speaking here. We don't think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. We can try it in another city, and we can see if maybe it's just something unique about Philadelphia that this business model doesn't work. Okay, not super excited. I don't know that it's anything terribly unique about Philly. Well, we can shut the company down and give you back the rest of the money. They'd maybe spent about 1/3 of the money they had raised at that point.
It was like 12 million at the point?
No, they had raised $750,000 at that point.
Okay.
And we said, well, that's not terribly exciting. While I'd certainly rather get money back than not get money back, we don't want to go 1/3 of the way down the path and just give up. He said, well, and here, or we can try something else. I said, okay, well, I'm intrigued by try something else. What did you have in mind? And he said, I'm glad you asked. And he opened up a Google document where they had apparently spent the last 2 weeks brainstorming, and they had 70 some odd business ideas that they had come up with, and ultimately had 3 or 4 that they wanted to build some level of MVP and actually try out.
How many people in the boardroom at that moment?
Half a dozen of us.
Awesome.
So it was me, it was Josh Koppelman from first round, it was Patrick Chung, who was leading the seed investing for NEA at the time. Yep. And it was the folks from what was then Storably. And I said, okay, well, we didn't just invest in this concept, we invested in you. So let's talk through some of these ideas, let's see if we think there's something there that is worth pursuing. And one of the ideas was there was this platform that was just coming to prominence at the time called Pinterest. And all the other social platforms, when brands wanted to be on the platform, there were pretty good analytics. There were pretty good ways of saying, well, what's happening with our brand on this platform? And the reason why that worked is because all these other platforms were happening in text. Pinterest had happened in pictures, and that was a very different problem to try to solve. And they thought they had found a way to solve for that. It helped brands get onto this hot platform where they wanted to be, where a lot of their customers were, but where they couldn't get any data to show that they're actually accomplishing anything by being on this platform. So we rolled the dice and we said, you know what? We believe in you, we like the idea, go for it. And so they took the last half or 2/3 or whatever it was of the money that they had from Storably, and they built Curelate from the ground up. And the thing that always stuck with me about that story, it's such a fine balance as an entrepreneur. You don't want to give up on something too quickly, but for those guys, if they hadn't come to the conclusion relatively quickly that it wasn't going to work, then they wouldn't have had the money left to do something else. And Curelate has gone on to be one of the bigger success stories in Philly. They employ 100 people. They've raised $35 million in capital. We're really excited to have been along for that ride, but that ride almost didn't happen.
Awesome. I mean, that's a pretty special story and something that sticks out at you, especially the insights that can come off of it. Stay there for a second. Talk to some of the folks that are in fundraising mode. What drew you to Nick? What are some of the things that not Apu. What drew you to Apu in regards to his leadership and leading up in those first 3 or 4 months to give him that type of, we have your back, bust out your Google Doc, show us 3 or 4 more ideas, but what are some of the quality traits that brought on that belief?
The first thing was his ability to recruit a team. So in the early days at Storably, he was able to recruit Nick. He was able to recruit Brendan Lowry, who's gone on to do terrific things. He was able to recruit Melissa Morris-Avone. They brought in several awesome people out of Weebly and out of a couple of the other platforms. the people that he was able to recruit, I mean, building your team is everything in a startup. And so seeing that he was able to bring people on and sell them on his vision, I think was incredibly important. The other thing that really got him that credibility was, first of all, the openness and the honesty to say plan A isn't working. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs who, when plan A doesn't work, they try to hide that plan A is not working, or they try to spin mediocre or bad numbers and try to say that they're really good, or find the one positive metric in a sea of things that aren't working. And that's relatively transparent, and that's not what we want to see. So his honesty and his openness, I think, was incredibly important. And also the fact that he was being really proactive about it. He had gone out, he got great feedback from the market. So it wasn't that he just got bored of it and decided to give up, but he gathered the data, and sometimes when the market's speaking, you've got to listen. But you only know that if you've got your ears open and you're trying to get that market feedback. He did. A lot of what you can do to make a really positive impression, though, is it's not about that first conversation. That first conversation is setting the baseline. So a lot of people feel like they're going to have a conversation with a VC and they're going to walk out with a check. And that may very well have been the case in 1999, but 1999 was a long time ago, and that's not really how the world works anymore. So I much prefer to meet entrepreneurs as early as possible. I like to meet people when they're thinking about, wouldn't it be cool if? And the best conversations are, this is what I think, these are the key hypotheses that I have to prove out in order to make my whole model work, and here's the steps that I'm going to take in order to do that as quickly as possible. And then I'll have that conversation, and then hopefully a few weeks later I'll sit down with that entrepreneur again, and they'll say, well, I told you I was going to do A, B, and C. And usually the way the conversations go when they're going well is, we did A, we started to do B, but we learned something. And this thing that we learned told us that the rest of B and C don't actually make any sense. So we did N instead, and now here's where we are. And what I've learned in 16 years of being a VC is that your business plan is wrong. I don't know where it's wrong yet when you give it to me, but it's wrong 100% of the time. You're making assumption layered on top of assumption layered on top of assumption. You can't possibly be right in all of those things. So the entrepreneurs that succeed are the ones who gather that market intelligence, listen to the market, and change direction to follow what they're hearing from their customers.
So stay there for a little bit. One of the things I think sets you apart from other capital partners in the industry is you connect with the entrepreneur really well. I can imagine the folks that are in the audience today and listening, there's ebbs and flows that come with entrepreneurship. Sometimes they come day by day, sometimes hour by hour, sometimes email by email, right? Very real. Walk us through, in your lens, what's Investor Ready look like? We just rolled out an accelerator in DC. We labeled it Investor Ready. We had hundreds of people apply. What's Investor Ready look like through your lens?
First of all, I don't know if there's any such thing as investor ready, because every investor is different. And I think sometimes people try to overgeneralize advice in the startup world, but in reality, it's easy to think of VCs as this monolithic group. In reality, it's a group of individuals, and let's be honest, often a bunch of really quirky individuals who all have their own preferences. One of the things that really drove it home for me was on the same day, I saw blog posts from, or maybe it was the same week, from two different VCs who I really respect. And it was Bijan Sabet at Spark Capital wrote a blog post all about, I don't care about your pitch deck, show me your product demo. Right after that, I read something from Paul Martino here in Philly at Bullpen Capital, who said, I don't care about your demo, show me your pitch deck. And it's like whiplash. How do you possibly, reconcile the two? And what you realize is it's all about the individual. It's all about who do you connect with, who are you on the same wavelength with, who's telling a story that you believe. And different people get convinced by different things. So Bijan's a product guy. He wants to see all the bells and whistles that you've built, and he wants to hear the user story and get into the shoes of the user and all about how you're solving their problem. Paul's a numbers guy. Paul's saying, I'm assuming if you're sitting here, you're building a product that's doing great things. Tell me the business story. Tell me who this is solving a problem for, how many people have that problem, what's the magnitude of the problem. So assuming that you've built the product that you say you've built, I know you've actually got a business. Sure. And I think it's really important when you're going into these meetings to do some homework. Find out who are you talking to, what do they like, what other deals have they done, who else have they worked with in the past, and that information's out there.
It's out there. Tell me what's interesting to you these days. What are you seeing red and blue? What are you looking at? What do you get excited about today, and what do you think you're going to get excited about a year from now?
I would say we're actually a less thematic investor than some other VCs. I think there are some VCs out there who have very specific themes that they're trying to invest in. They'll say, hey, we're very big believers in the future of work, and so we're going to invest in things that are along those lines, or human-computer interaction, or the blockchain, or whatever the topic du jour might be. We're somewhat more opportunistic in terms of the sectors that get us excited, because ultimately, VC and entrepreneurship in general is a power law business. You know, the number one or number two players in the market get a vastly disproportionate share of the exit value compared to everybody else. And so because we're so focused around Penn, I'm not really in a position to say, I'm going to do the best drone company, because the best drone company may be a Penn company or it may not be a Penn company. So instead, I have to look around the ecosystem here and say, what companies that are happening here have the chance to be the number one player in their market, as opposed to picking the market first and then trying to find the company.
Yeah, great advantage. Walk us through, what are some of the things that people may think of the Penn DNA, the Penn entrepreneur, that's either spot on or false? What are some of the things that surprise you now that you're that deep in that ecosystem?
First of all, I think the thing that surprises a lot of people is just how many entrepreneurs are coming out of Penn. I think particularly Wharton historically is really known for investment banking and consulting and finance jobs. Wharton's become an incredibly entrepreneurial place over the last few years. It's been really fun to see how many classes now end with a pitch deck rather than ending with a final where you're writing a whole bunch of stuff in a blue book. And I think the engineering school is doing that as well, and the nursing school is now becoming increasingly entrepreneurial, and the university as a whole is really embracing innovation and change, and it's slowly but surely moving from we're going to help you get a job when you graduate mentality to we're going to help you create jobs when you graduate mentality.
Yeah, it's case in point when you have PCI in this beautiful building, Penn Innovation Center, and the staff that's pushing not just Penn, but other students and other entrepreneurs through that pathway. Stay there a little bit. We talked about the Penn ecosystem. Talk about Philadelphia for a second. 90% of venture capital is going to 3 states, right? New York, Massachusetts, and California. What does Philly need to see more of besides the obvious, and how do we get there? How do you talk about Philadelphia when you're amongst your other peers and other ecosystems?
I think Philly has a lot of the raw materials. I think Philly has several fantastic universities that are cranking out raw talent. I think there is a very involved ecosystem of larger companies. You see folks like Comcast, you see folks like Independence Blue Cross, you see the Penn Health System that are involved with the entrepreneurial ecosystem, that are available as customers, that are available as advisors, that are available as funding sources or potential acquirers for these companies. A lot of that is there. I think the challenge that Philly has is that ideally in an ecosystem, you get this positive spiral where you have a couple of companies that grow really big, they hire a bunch of people, and they ultimately get to an exit. And following that exit, 2 things happen. Right away, capital infuses back into the ecosystem. Yep. So suddenly everybody's happy, everybody's got some more money in their pockets, and they're looking to invest again, because if you invest in a startup and you make a lot of money in that startup, you're pretty excited to invest in another one. The other thing is that usually the 12 to 24 months following that acquisition, a lot of talent flows back into the ecosystem. It's people who have leveled up. So you work at a startup, you get to an exit, and you usually don't stay with the acquirer forever. And so what happens is the VP level people from that company go work for the acquirer for a while, and then they go out and they become the C-level people at the next generation of companies. The C-level people from those companies, sometimes they become angel investors, sometimes they start other companies. All that talent levels up and fuses back into the ecosystem to both start additional companies, to fund additional companies, and to reinforce the companies that were being started already. And unfortunately, we haven't had enough of the exits in Philly to really get that spiral going. And I'm hopeful that some of the companies that are out there today will be the ones that drive that. But I don't think it's something that you can force, and it's certainly not something that happens overnight.
No, I mean, obviously we have great champions like PSL that continue to stretch the game and show access and tell a story that's relevant, not just in Philadelphia and our region, but nationally. And that's important. Entrepreneurs like Alex that show up and are responsive and are willing to be mentored and mentor others and be approachable. That stuff matters. I want to we have 10 companies coming through our accelerator in DC. We're doing matchmaking right now to identify what mentors would fit them best. What do you think the DNA of a really good mentor for an early stage company that's about to raise their first round of seed capital look like? What's the DNA? What's the qualities?
Ideally, it's someone who's had both successes and failures in their career. I think often people who have only had success, and in particular people who have had one big success, tend to sort of overfit that curve, and they try to just run that same playbook from the last company. I think sometimes being a second-time entrepreneur is a real challenge. So people who have had successes that they can learn from, but you learn a lot from the failures as well. Not that they're super enjoyable. I think Bob Mowell was talking the other day on Twitter about how sometimes failure is over glorified, and while it's happening, it really sucks. But you do learn a lot from it. So I think that's really important. I think people who are willing to listen is incredibly important as a mentor. I think often you have mentors who think they know everything, and they want to be sort of the sage, just dispensing advice for everyone to go follow. And they may have great insights and great advice, but they're not day-to-day on the ground with the entrepreneur, seeing what the entrepreneur is seeing. So I think recognizing your own limitations is really important in a mentor as well.